you have to take off these lug nuts. They're torqued to 250 foot-pounds on the front, 350 on the back. According to what I found on the internet, this says left on it, clear as day. Left hand thread. That's why it says left. And here's the thing that makes it even more exciting. These ones over here, these are marked right. So these are standard threads like you would find on any other vehicle. You turn it left to loosen. These ones over here are reverse thread. And then once you strip them, sometimes the stud comes free, which is what happened to me. And you have to torch off the nut. So fortunately I had a cutting torch. Don't make the same mistake I did, guys. Left hand side is left hand thread. To do this brake job, all you have to do is just take out this little bolt right here and knock out this slider towards me. Right here you see me bashing this with a hammer, but if you stick a screwdriver into the hole in the caliper, you can pry against the rotor and loosen it up in 1 second. The other way to compress these pistons is the same as usual with the C-clamp. I have to get this rotor off, so there's just 4 little bolts, 1/2-inch bolts. That lets this cover off. This is some kind of a plastic composite, it seems like. The other side was actually broken. There's gear oil inside this. It looks like there's a greasable option for this because there's a hole for a grease zerk on these, but we obviously have the oil bath. So that's a nut cover. So we need to get this out, and then there should be a nut under there that can be removed. Got that. 1 5/8. Just for fun, I'm gonna see how tight this goes. Oh yeah, that goes a lot tighter. The reason I wanted to know that is because when I put this back together, I don't know the exact sequence or the torque on how to reinstall that nut. Typically you just tighten it where it's really tight and you spin the wheel, and then when the wheel starts to get snug, you back it off till it feels loose again. They often have a torque and then a second torque that they do it, but if you can just sort of guesstimate how tight it was and then how far it has to back out, then that solves the mystery of how tight it needs to be. Big washer and a bearing. Wow, I thought I was going to see a bigger bearing. Whoa, buddy. Whoa, buddy. The hub can stay as it is with the bearing, but it needs the rotor removed off of it. Yeah, this rotor is ruined. It's also important to note there are some washers that come off of these studs. Don't lose those washers on your work area.
We have to put the bearing first?
Nope. Bearings. At this point, you're supposed to get this thing nice and tight, and then there's always a sequence for backing it out the perfect amount, and then you give it a final torque. But I didn't really know what any of those numbers were, so I just went pretty loco tight with this thing, and then I just backed it out, and I spun it once I got it tight, so I knew that it was getting pretty snug. It gets to a point where you can't go any tighter and it'll still turn. And then you just back it out a little bit, and you'll see in a second it's nice and loosey-goosey when it spins.
expert.
Right?
I didn't fully know what I was doing on this first one, adding this gear lube to this hub. But basically, when you first add the gear lube through this little hole that I'm taking the head off, um, you, you pour it in there, and then it pushes through the bearing into the hollow in the hub.
How much gear?
And so it fills up a much larger space. I didn't really give it a chance to settle, but if I would have sat there and waited for a minute, that fluid would have settled down. What I like to do is just keep adding fluid, you know, and watching it settle until it seems overly full, and then it'll lose a little fluid as you're driving the truck, but it comes out the end of the hub and goes out onto the wheels, so it's not harming anything. That back seal is still holding any fluid that's trying to get out of the hub, so it's not getting on the rotor. This top area where I'm about to be putting the grease is actually not the correct spot for the grease. It's actually supposed to be on the slide that we're about to pound in there once the caliper is in place. Because this section here, the slide is permanently affixed over top of it, and then the secondary piece moves on that. It's hard to describe, but basically the grease was needlessly put right there in that upper portion.
That's how you do it. Wow. Just like that. I did this wrong before. The slider, this does not go here. It goes like this. And then the part with the bolt goes there. Yeah, should have been more like this.
Oh yeah, that did enter way smoother.
Reinstalling the wheel can be pretty hard on this truck because the wheel plus tire is too heavy for a guy to lift. You're not going to pick it up and jam it on there. Even like a pickup truck tire, like a reasonably strong individual can put a pickup tire on there without too much difficulty. But these tires are just so heavy, you have to use the jack to raise the truck up or down, or you can put a pry bar up under the wheel and push up and down on it to help locate it properly to the studs. And if you're like me and you destroyed your studs by tightening the reverse threads instead of loosening them, then you have the joy of pulling in these new studs, which requires an excessive amount of force. You can't do it with a 1/2-inch impact. Like a DeWalt and a Milwaukee, you could probably do it, but you'd be sitting there impacting it for a long time. And I was doing this with a chrome socket. I really didn't want to put the wear on that chrome socket because I was afraid I was going to void the warranty or even diminish my chances even more than what I already had of being able to warranty it if I needed to. So I'm just doing these with I don't know what that is, but that's a high force torque wrench we have that we're using to tighten that in. And this took us a good 30-45 minutes. I mean, it was just a lot. It was a lot of labor tightening these in.
1.5 inches. This is a 13/16 square drive for pulling out these studs.
This tool is really hard to find. The local hardware store that's good around here did have different versions of that, but not in a 1/2 inch or 3/4 drive. So I ended up having to order it off of Amazon, and I got it from Right Tool. They were on there. It came within just 1 or 2 days. Those little studs, they're actually like a nut, and they're a stud that threads on to the inner stud, and it holds on the inner wheel. So like a couple of those, I could not get them off. I used my long handled 3/4 inch drive ratchet, could not get it to save my life, and so this torch saved my life, because if I didn't have this, I really don't know how I would have gotten them out. If you're doing this job, I wish you the best of luck. You're going to need a torch. I don't know what else to say. Well, a little heat don't hurt. Taking off this caliper and brake pads is the same arrangement as the front calipers. The only difference being that the bolt and the slide, spring slide, are on the bottom of this caliper instead of the top.
This is what the brake pads look like. This material is kind of coming apart. I really couldn't tell you why. Excessive pressure and heat? Who knows? But it's not smooth. It's all super abrasive, like little threads coming off of it almost. It feels fuzzy. Yeah, this pad is just coming apart, like under my fingers. So much material just coming off of it when I touch it. This pad is wrecked. That needs to be replaced. These rotors, you see these little cracks? I can feel the cracks with my fingernail. It's called heat checking. Supposedly you can turn these rotors, but I have to talk to somebody about that. That's the source of the noise. There's no checking on the inside. It's totally smooth.
These are actually studs, not bolts, and so when you start trying to take them off, you might end up having a nut in your hand. You might end up having a stud with a nut stuck to it. I tried to get the nuts off these studs and I could not get them off and without damaging the threads, and so I just took them off however they came off, and I reinstalled them the same way. Well, you didn't get to see it, but I had to buy this giant socket. This is 3 1/4. I was trying to hammer the outer nut with a chisel, but it was damaging the nut too much. So I got the socket and came back, took this off. Then this piece holds on the inner nut. And then you get the inner nut, which is the same. And then when it's time to get the rotor off, the whole hub comes out, and then this bearing will fall out, so you try to retrieve that before it falls on the ground. Yeah, the rotor looks like it's the same for the front and the back, so I'm just gonna go to the place I got my rotors before, and I'm gonna grab new rotors. My mechanic friend told me that these cracks can go in really far, and a lot of time you're better off just replacing the rotor. So that's $200 a rotor. So 200, 200, and then 200 for the brake pads, $600 for a brake job. But yeah, these are ate up, and you can tell by the thickness of these new pads that the old pads were really worked for a long time. So that's okay. We'll do a brake job, no problem. I actually had to end up taking this nut off because I spoke to my mechanic friend and he told me that he usually adds gear lube to this hub because it takes a little time for fluid to make its way from the differential to the hub. And so you want to have some in there to start with so that the bearings can be wet. But eventually more fluid will regulate its way into that hub and just kind of pour out there as you go around corners. So this is basically just me undoing what I just did and then putting everything back together. I'm using Permatex right stuff to make a fast gasket here. That was all the previous person used, so don't be deceived by the caulk gun. That's just how it came to me from Amazon. I didn't want to have to deal with those like self-pumping pressurized cans that always dry up and don't work anymore. I'm using threadlocker orange. I didn't have the green. I'm not sure what the uses are of the green, but I had the orange, which is stronger than the blue, but still removable with hand tools. And so I put that on the coarse threads of these studs. Any one of the studs that came out, I put that on there. And then the ones that didn't come out, I wasn't worried about it. Obviously, the threadlocker worked on those ones. And then the final torque of the installation is definitely applied through the fine thread on the outside end of that stud. All right, so at this point, I discovered that they did not have the spring clips. Here's an example of a spring clip. This is an example of one that had pulled off and destroyed from the front ones and drove over it with my van. It keeps an anti-rattle clip is what it is. So now I got to go back out again to get anti-rattle clips because my kit didn't come with them. It came with these. The kit with the front pads came with the anti-rattle, but the rear pads came with this hardware. So I don't know what the deal is with these people playing games with me over here. Look at these pads are already rusty, look. That's awesome. I could not compress the rear caliper pistons with the vise or the channel lock that I used for the fronts. So I ended up using a C-clamp and a pry bar to press in both of these pistons at the same time. So the international dealer says, well, that's not good. We don't have a torque spec. Must be because this truck is too old. Oh, so what do you guys at your shop torque it to when they're working on a truck like this? Oh, they just run it in with a 1 inch. So that's what you're getting when you go to international dealers. Nice. So there you go, guys. I'm just gonna put this last wheel on there and I'm gonna spare you the agony of seeing me struggle with the other side. I mean, the left side was actually a lot less trouble because, you know, the process of this entire day was me driving back and forth for the tools and the parts that I didn't have or whatever, and I didn't know what rotors I needed until I took it off and compared it to the old rotors from the fronts, and I had a suspicion that they were all going to be the same because this was a four-wheel disc brake truck, kind of in the old days back when disc brakes were almost a novelty item. And I just suspected they were all going to be the same. They had the same kind of components to them, but I couldn't get the rotor off without that socket, and so I drove out in the morning to get the socket. And then I needed to go get the rotors, and thankfully the Napa dealership delivers, and so they delivered me my brake pads, and I didn't have to go out for a fourth trip for them, but then I had to go back out for that little spring clip. And so I spent a good half of my day driving back and forth, and then half of my day I spent working on this, which is an extraordinary amount of time to spend on a brake job. But it's my first time doing a truck this size. I think if I was better equipped, if I had a full shop full of tools that was already pre-set up to do this type of work, I think I probably could have knocked this out in a good 2 hours. Still, it's kind of excessive for a brake job, it seems like, but you're dealing with heavier components. Everything's put together a little bit differently on these trucks, and it's much the same on a dually Dodge or a dually Ford pickup truck. You got to pull the axle and the hub on the rears to get access to the rotor. So anyways, hopefully this video has been a help to you guys. If you're wondering about the torque spec on the rear, I grabbed that long, which is like a 3.5, 4 foot long torque wrench, and I just tightened it to the point where I felt like I was putting my full body weight on that thing, and that's probably more than 300 foot-pounds. So I figured some of the torque specs that I saw for these older trucks was around 350 foot-pounds. So I thought if I put roughly 350, that would be okay. And I didn't want to just trust an impact to get it. I wanted to know that I felt that torque with my hands when I put it together. So you're definitely going to need that long torque wrench or long breaker bar or something just long, unless you really want to trust your impact to it, in which case, you know, have fun, have at it. I'm not very trusting of those things. I think they have a tendency to either be a little bit too loose or a little bit too tight. Sometimes you don't really know if it's a thread pattern you're not used to dealing with or something like that. You could go way over tight or way under tight and not even realize it. So have a great day, guys.